Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your early warning roundtable for Friday, the 24th of January, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. As a reminder, we do this every single Friday, 10 a.m. Central Time. Each analyst gets their turn to brief their biggest takeaway or their most pressing item for the day. And then we open up for Q&A after that. So bring your questions. Happy to have you here. Today, we're talking about geopolitical alignment. This is what Trump is facing. This is the new geopolitical landscape that Trump is facing. It is vastly different from the one that he saw in his first term. Then we'll move on to looking at this realist foreign policy. What does this actually mean for the United States? I'll jump on and discuss whether or not there's a way ahead for the far left in the United States in 2025 and beyond. And then we'll wrap up with an update on the risk of renewed conflict between Israel and Gaza. We'll open it up for questions. With that, let's go ahead and get into today's first topic. Jared, good morning. So you say that Trump is facing a vastly different geopolitical landscape today than what he saw during his first term. You've updated your geopolitical alignment map. Take us through it.
Absolutely. So based on the alignment that we're seeing here, I think that war with China in the latest Trump term is the risk of this is drastically diminished. Now, as far as why now, Trump has assumed office and ordered his State Department to pursue a pragmatic foreign policy focused on making America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. Overall, for the outlook, I think that this is favorable for the United States to achieve the safer, stronger, more prosperous goals. And the fallout of Trump's first administration is actually bearing fruit in the Pacific with cooperation between the Quadrilateral Dialogue, the European powers, and many ASEAN nations toward the same end as America, which appears to be a stable Asian Pacific while they remove dependence on China. Now, as far as implications, based off the exercise I've seen, the national security strategy updates, China now surely faces Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, America, Australia, Canada, the UK, France, and India if it moves on Taiwan or upsets the balance of power in the South China Sea with the Philippines. Additionally, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore are likely combatants based off of the exercise that we're seeing ongoing with the French right now. This mitigates the risk of a trade war escalating into a hot war and denies the 2027 timeline.
So, Jared, it seems like your bottom line here is that China still isn't they are not ready for war today. They will probably not be ready for war tomorrow. And effectively, their window has closed. Do I get that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I want to key in on this French naval exercise. I also want to get Max's take on this. But so it's France, the UK, the United States, a whole bunch of other countries, and they're practicing, I believe it's going on right now, they're practicing shutting down the Malacca Strait and then the secondary and tertiary straits through which China would receive something like 80% of its oil. So these are a bunch of Western and Asian countries effectively trying to blockade Chinese oil imports, which is going to potentially doom any kind of long-term action. Is that what you're seeing right now?
Yes, absolutely. And the exercise thing that we're at Friday, I think the last one just wrapped up, but there are follow-on exercises for France to move up to South China Sea and Philippine Sea in order to practice combat with the Philippines, Japan, America, all of us there in where the primary bits of fighting would actually be if we had to go to war with China.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next question. Trump says he's an anti-war president. In the context of a potential war with China before he leaves office, do you believe him?
I believe he's anti-war, but part of being an anti-war president, I think you also have to have the threat of don't make me go to war, I will, and it will be bad for you. Otherwise, you're just a weak president.
Okay, fair enough. Let's bring Max on. Max, I want to get your take on this. There's a little bit of a sparring match here before we went live. It was very entertaining for me, I just got to say. Max, let's start with the same question to you. Trump says he's anti-war president, no new wars. In the context of war with China, do you believe him? Oh, we got to unmute you.
Technology. That's tough, Mike, because I believe Trump is an anti-war president, but we're in a situation now, foreign policy-wise, geopolitically, where we've got to show real deterrence to countries like China that are not just competitors, but significant adversaries that have opposing geopolitical interest with the U.S. I mean, we do not agree. We do not agree with China's nine-line claims. We don't agree with their bullying the Philippines and Japan, and those are two strong allies for the U.S. We have opposing ideas on what the Pacific should look like, and there's really not a lot of room to compromise. So what you really have to do from the U.S. and the Trump perspective is put forward a very clear and legitimate deterrent to keep China, to contain China. And I think part of that deterrent is the ability for the U.S. and its allies to engage in combat and maintain and sustain combat in the Pacific. And like we were talking about earlier before the show, I don't think that the U.S. nor its allies have a mature enough logistical footprint in the Pacific to really, to legitimately call their forces a deterrent to China. And I think China knows that. And so Trump has a lot of work to do. It's not just, getting the U.S. Navy to bust the rust off of its ships and straighten up and fly right, like the U.S. Navy used to do, but it's also about reindustrializing America and getting our allies to reindustrialize to the point where we are logistically mature and we do form that rational, legitimate deterrent against China. And that's the only way we're going to contain them. I mean, the exercise Jared's talking about is great. They're doing great things out there, but that's just an exercise. They came across the ocean and they did an exercise. But where are the repair depots for long-term sustained combat? Where are the precision-guided munitions, the long-range attack missiles, hardened aircraft shelters, the entire gamut of things we would need if we were gonna, go to blows with China? I think we're pointed in the right direction, but we're just now stepping off.
Mm-hmm. All right, Max and Jared, I want to let you respond to each other just briefly. This French-led exercise, it's alongside the United States, the UK, India, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, and Canada. And these exercises are in succession. So they're looking at blocking the Malacca Strait, the Sunda Strait, and the Lombok Straits. And again, these are the primary, secondary, and tertiary routes for China to get oil. Jared, back over to you. You say this is very significant. You say France has a first-rate navy, and you say this is a big deal. Does this look more to you like more deterrence, or are these countries actively preparing? Are they actually going to shut down the Malacca Strait to try to degrade Chinese military capability?
I think they are actively preparing for it. And the reason I say that is that all of them view the status quo of the Pacific, where it's generally peaceful. There are territorial disputes, but it doesn't really rise to the level of war, as necessary for their continued existence. That doesn't mean they have not all of them have formalized it. As far as I know, only the Philippines and Japan have. However, if it was just France running this, or maybe France and the Philippines, where they step into the Malacca Strait, Sunda and Lombok, then I would say, yeah, this is probably important, but not game-changing. It was the inclusion of Indonesia, who we've been tracking for a couple of weeks now. They've been even though they joined BRICS, they've been making very big overtures away from China. The inclusion of Indonesia, the inclusion of Malaysia, who controls the other half of the Malacca Strait, and the mouth up into the South China Sea is extremely significant, because they were committing naval assets. They were not just committing oh yeah, we'll have advisors or observe. No, they had ships on the water practicing, shutting down these straits. And Singapore, which Singapore is small, it can't be considered a first-rate navy, but if it were larger, it would absolutely rival somebody like Japan. It is for what it is, it's a very powerful little navy, and it sits right at the mouth of the Malacca Strait. It can shut it down on its own. The cooperation of all three of those, plus the star quarterback of the French carrier strike group, I think poses an enormous threat and shows an actual resolve toward, we will blockade you, and the U.S. doesn't even have to be here.
Jared, last question to you, and I'll flip it over to Max. Does this look like a scenario where these countries say, we're going to prevent oil tankers from transiting these straits? Okay, that's fine. I get that. What happens if the Chinese Navy, the PLAN, show up? Do they have any? I don't even know if this is technically blue water. I'm not a Navy guy, but just describe to me, what would it take for China to try to blockade or to try to end that blockade? Do they have the ability to? Can they sink these ships with long range fires? I mean, what's their response?
So in a vacuum, yeah, China could go break that blockade. Wouldn't be a big issue. But this blockade is specifically preparing a response to a blockade of Taiwan. So it would already have to have a massive force commitment to blockading Taiwan, which we've covered in the past, pretty much immediately guarantees a fight with Japan and the Philippines, because they both have territory and blood and national security enshrinement for the protection of Taiwan via the Batanes and Nance Islands. So could they do that and also break this blockade? No, especially because they would have to go through the South China Sea, which is going to be hostile at that point, to break the blockade.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's an interesting argument. Max, I want to get your take on this. It sounds like this is these Western and some Asian countries like holding the sword of Damocles over Chinese oil supply if they do move to Taiwan. Jared says they can't do both. They can't block this Strait of Malacca blockade, or they can't destroy this blockade of the Strait of Malacca and also take Taiwan simultaneously. What do you say to that?
I agree with Jared that the Malacca Straits are definitely a pressure point for the Chinese, and it is one of the pressure points that we should be applying or should be planning to apply pressure to in order to change or influence Chinese behavior vis-a-vis Taiwan. But I think we're in the same boat as China here in terms of being spread pretty thin. Yes, we can have the Europeans like get a hand-holding coalition together and sail around the Malacca Straits and prevent oil tankers from going to China. But those are forces that are not going to be able to oppose a Chinese blockade on Taiwan. So does that leave the U.S. to handle the Taiwan thing with maybe Japan or, a little bit of help from the Philippines? I don't know. I don't think that one of those forces, let's say the European coalition at the Malacca Straits, I don't think they can withstand China's long-range fires because they don't have any ability to regenerate forces. They really don't have a thorough refit and repair facility that they can move to quickly. It all boils down to logistics. I mean, really what we're banking on here when we talk about this is a game of chicken where nobody really wants to start the fight. China doesn't want to start the fight because they're not really ready to start the fight. They don't have their ducks in a row, although they do have a logistically mature footprint and we are fighting in their backyard. They still don't want to start the fight. There's a lot of repercussions from that. And the U.S. Wants to make it look like it can start the fight, but it can't really because it doesn't have the logistical ass in the Pacific. And the European nations out there are just kind of like posers because they have an even smaller logistical footprint in the Pacific. So it's all a game of chicken and who believes who and who's going to call. It's like poker, I guess, is a better word for it instead of game of chicken. It's a poker game, and we're kind of betting that nobody's going to call our bluff here because it pretty much is a bluff.
All right, just briefly here, Jared, if just bottom line, and we'll move on. If I could suss out the bottom line here. You've said for some time that all this talk about war with China in 2027, the Chinese have been talking about it. U.S. generals and admirals have been talking about this 2027 date. You say it is increasingly unlikely. Is that the case that you're making here?
Yes, I would say it's increasingly unlikely to the point where I think they're going to move it, and we will not see a 2027 move on Taiwan.
Okay. Max, what's your outlook here?
I think it is increasingly unlikely, but like barely increasingly unlikely. I think what in my view, what's making it increasingly unlikely is Trump in the White House, and Trump wants to reindustrialize America. He's already been kicking the Europeans in the butt on GDP spending for national defense and for alliances. And that's a whole new game. We have not seen that the last 4 years. And even when Trump was here in his first administration, that kind of talk is being undermined by people within his administration, particularly within the office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There was no effort to kind of push this, but now there is. And the more we reindustrialize, the more we gain that logistical footprint in the Pacific, the more exponentially the likelihood of China stepping over the line of departure on Taiwan, the more that decreases.
All right. Gentlemen, great discussion. Things change. I'd love to continue to update this, maybe once a quarter, every 6 months or so. All right. Max and Jared, thanks so much. We're going to move on now to the next item. Robert, let's bring you on. And Jared just said the Trump administration is facing vastly different geopolitical landscape now than he was in the last term. And I guess this is probably one reason why we are moving to what people call a realist foreign policy. So explain what's happening.
So this is a major sea change for U.S. foreign policy from the last few decades. Under the realist framework, there's 2 key points here. One, realists view the global order as anarchical rather than hierarchical, basically saying that there is no, top level authority that can just reach down and solve issues, and then that states are security seeking. And I think these 2 points are important because the previous foreign policy framework we've been working under has been under, what would be called a liberal framework, where there's a major emphasis on building institutional power and things like economic interdependence, which is something we've also hit on a lot. And I think why this is happening now, the Trump administration is coming in and bringing in foreign policy officials like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Elbridge Colby at the Department of Defense as Undersecretary for Policy. And these are a lot of these people coming into the Trump administration may have put a lot of weight into this realist framework. And I think looking at this is going to change how the U.S. addresses China, because this is also the pivot to China is a major foreign policy issue for the Trump administration. And they have been able to, over the last few decades, use, I think, the liberal framework of U.S. foreign policy to expand their influence, especially in Africa and Latin America, where the previous foreign policy apparatus has really focused on, I think, political, ideological objectives over what the Trump administration is signaling as pragmatic diplomacy and a focus on national security and American security. As far as outlook, I think there is a chance here that, China could decide that weathering the storm, so to speak, of the Trump administration and this major change in foreign policy is preferable, and expect a reversion to the status quo since basically the end of the Soviet Union. But I think that getting this into gear now and having the next roughly 3.5 years or so to get the machinery in place, especially in some key areas in the Western Hemisphere like Latin America, to push out a lot of this Chinese and Russian influence, will make it more difficult for this reversion to happen.
Mm-hmm. Robert, just looking at U.S. grand strategy here, it seems like we really have not had a grand strategy, unfortunately. I hope we do now. I always go back to John Boyd's definition of grand strategy, which is connecting yourself to as many power centers as possible while simultaneously disconnecting your opponent from as many power centers as possible. I go back to 2022. Saudi Arabia started flirting with this idea of joining BRICS. Maybe they would sell their oil in Chinese renminbi. It seemed like a really big loss for the United States' influence in the Middle East. And I think part of that is because we were pushing all the gay pride flags and all this, all the social policies. And if these countries didn't go along with it, then they got the cold shoulder from Biden. And Mohammed bin Salman said, okay, that's fine. I can give the United States a cold shoulder too. And I just remember looking at that and said, man, how unfortunate this whole thing is, because it really is quite needless. Mark, you had a point on this. I just want to end here by saying Trump's back in the White House. Mohammed bin Salman said he would offer $600 billion or something like that in foreign direct investment in the United States. I guess the Saudis have it. I'm not sure that that SoftBank and these other folks have that kind of cash. But this is a really big deal, because it does seem like we're regaining a major influence partner in the Middle East. With that, let's bring Mark on for your take. Mark, you're pretty familiar with Bridge Colby.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this is a breath of fresh air for the United States. I think really fundamentally the United States has a long tradition of a kind of practical realism. We don't really engage much in the theorizing, like when we've been the most effective. It's more taking a very pragmatic approach to foreign policy. You could even call it realpolitik. Elbridge Colby understands this. I think he realizes that the United States has geopolitical rivals that are much more important than some of these regional fixations that we've had in the last 20 years, namely the Middle East. And I think what he is trying to do is he's trying to ensure that the United States can secure its limited interests in other parts of the world. Middle East is a good example, while not sacrificing key partnerships and alliances, while not completely abandoning those regions, but allowing for a balance of power to take place in those parts of the world so that we can focus on geopolitical rivals elsewhere. One of the things that's been kind of a dogfight right now is there's been a lot of pushback with some of the appointments that are close to Elbridge Colby, insinuating that these appointments are being pro-Iran or other things like that. But really, what we're seeing is that this is a discussion of strategy and balance of power. So it's not about saying who are the good guys or the bad guys and trying to force regime change on the bad guys or whatever. What it really is doing is trying to strike a balance of power, recognizing that the game board is what it is. And the best case scenario for the United States is to be able to have as much flexibility and latitude as possible to be able to secure our national interest while focusing on geopolitical rivals. So I think this is going to be controversial on the right, particularly. I think that you're going to see kind of this divide between how is the United States going to focus on China while being able to secure some of its interests in the Middle East. This is going to require somewhat of a sea change. And so my thoughts on this are that we're not really out of the woods. I think Bridge Colby is very interesting and a breath of fresh air for the United States, but he is going to be resisted by a lot of people on the Republican side of the fence. There's going to be a lot of pressure for Trump to kind of resist his vision for U.S. foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that Bridge Colby has said is that Europe is not the decisive theater, right? NATO, Russia, all that stuff over there is not the decisive theater for the United States. It is, in fact, the Indo-Pacific and China. And so it really does look like this is part of a big pivot towards China. Last thing, actually two other things we'll move on. We're going to talk about the far left next. But before we do, little Marco, I saw his speech. And one of the things he said, he said there were like three metrics by which he would judge all actions at the State Department. I thought they were pretty good, but I don't remember what they are. Mark or Jared or Robert, do you remember what they are?
Yeah, there were three questions or criteria that they wanted to put every program, every kind of fund, every dollar spent would have to answer. Does this make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Does it make America more prosperous? And one thing I'll add to that is that often we think that complexity, that we have to have complex solutions to complex problems. And that's kind of the opposite. Where we've been most effective is when we've had very simple common sense solutions to very complex problems. Much of the complexity that exists in policy, that, as they say, the devil's in the details, that's where it often masks corruption. When we have complex policies, when we have complex relationships, that's where the problems start. And so I think that people might think that this is simplistic, but this is a breath of fresh air because it is a very effective way to evaluate on whether our policies are actually benefiting the United States, benefiting Americans, or whether they're benefiting the self-licking ice cream cone that we have in DC.
Mm-hmm. All right. Amen, brother. Hey, Robert, I'll let you answer that question. Thanks for that, Mark. But Robert, I do have one other question for you. Speaking of these pro-Iranian figures, this Tabatabai figure, she was, I guess, the Undersecretary of Defense for SOLIC, Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. Please tell me she's been fired. What's the update on that?
I haven't seen any coverage of her being fired, but considering that the Trump administration is right now clearing out the National Security Council and getting all these career appointees out, I think I would bet that she has been, basically told not to report to work.
Don't
yeah,
come
because
tomorrow. And just remind us briefly, what exactly were her ties to Iran?
It was through the Iran experts group and the Robert Malley, who was Biden's Iran envoy, who was walked out of work, but somehow allowed to also still maintain his clearance and access to some programs after it was found out that he had ties to this Iran experts group, which was effectively an Iranian government cutout.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. All right. Robert, I'll give you the last word here on American grand strategy briefly.
Yeah, I think Mark has a really good point. This is a return to a cohesive American grand strategy that I don't think we really had under the Biden administration, and to the idea that, this complex solution thing. Well, yeah, that does. I think under the Biden administration, there was not this top-down pressure to implement a cohesive grand strategy. So it allowed a lot of people in the national security apparatus to kind of get their own pet issues in. And I mean, it's not just the Biden administration. It's been over the last 20 years since the first Obama administration, where they can do a lot of focus on their own pet issues that didn't necessarily advance America's position geostrategically.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks for staying on top of this, Robert. And great job explaining this mega shift that's happening. All right, we're going to move on now to the far left. And I'll just tell you, we all know this. Momentum on the far left remains really low, especially compared to where we were in 2017. That I can recall, there have been 3 Antifa Black Bloc demonstrations since the election. And the first happened in Seattle, Washington. That was on election night. It was short-lived march. It ended with 5 arrests. So Seattle police actually made some arrests of Antifa. And then there have been 2 events in Portland, Oregon. One was at an anti-Trump march on Inauguration Day. Portland police also made a handful of arrests for people, I guess, spray painting graffiti. And then there was another that happened just recently, and it maybe Monday night. There was a direct action demonstration. Maybe like 15 militants showed up outside the ICE facility in Portland, Oregon, and the Antifa militants lit a small fire. I don't believe there were any arrests that were made. And, we may actually include a 4th one in there. This was also in Portland on Sunday night. There was a bunch of windows smashed at the Multnomah County election building. And that's pretty typical for Antifa. So maybe we'll say that's like the 4th kind of Black Bloc direct action demonstration. But in the large scheme of things, that is still relatively low volume, and it's low energy, folks, really. So now we can compare that to January 2017. Over 200 Antifa militants were arrested over Inauguration Day demonstrations. So we really are looking at a weakened, fragmented movement and just a lot of dormant affinity groups that have not reactivated thus far. Also, last weekend we saw the Festivals of Resistance. That was like 20 to 25 events around the country where these left-wing militants gathered for workshops and training, and they're really trying to rekindle that sense of urgency and try to rebuild the networks that have atrophied and resume their organizing efforts. And that was the sole intended purpose of these Festivals of Resistance, was to bring people off the sidelines, get them linked back up, and start organizing for some response. Some of those events, or at least one of those events, had several hundred people show up. So, and that was between far left militants and then also the more progressive and socialist political activists. So this is the big umbrella known as the so-called anti-fascist movement. So we are seeing some limited efforts to regroup. 2020 is not happening, I don't think. We're not even we're not even really close to 2017 style. So that shows you just how weak the overall the far left movement has been. I see that Antifa continues to face some severe limitations, even in their tier 1 cities like Portland and Seattle. Tier 1 cities historically, Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, those are probably the big 5. Everything else, I don't even think they're really tier 2 cities anymore. And so this just goes to show how vastly different conditions are compared to 2017. So the 3 limitations, I already talked about this, but just briefly. Atrophied networks is their big limitation. They've got to get folks off the sidelines, and that means they need to rekindle that sense of urgency. Maybe these deportations do it. We've seen some deportation protests. I would have to go back. I don't think we have seen, I've not seen any significant direct action demonstrations. Nothing like what we saw during the last Trump administration, like the de-arrests where activists will actually go in and try to pull illegal aliens away from law enforcement custody. We saw that all throughout the first Trump administration. Excuse me. We've seen a lot of de-arrest training. So far, I haven't seen any major direct action, but that is obviously coming, I think. The second major limiting factor is risk of arrest. Again, these people are being arrested now. No one's kneeling for BLM. No one's kneeling for Palestine. It is just a completely different situation. Even in Portland and Seattle, police are making arrests. And then the third thing is the national mood. I think Americans are they're just tired of far left violence. And I think they're over it. I think no one wants to see businesses smashed. No one wants to see roads blocked. I don't think even progressive city leaders really have an appetite for that kind of very disruptive and violent action. And so that is Antifa, as I say, that's Antifa's really third limiting factor. So just a couple of outlooks here. A 2020 style insurrection is unlikely this year, I think, especially. That would change. The one linchpin, I think, is the economy. We go back to 2020 and what were really the enabling factors of 2020? Recession and lockdowns. People were out of work. They weren't in school. They got stimulus, so they had walking around money. And 2020 would not have happened at the scale it did were it not for the recession and stimulus. So people have been talking about what's the real economic strength going into the Trump administration? What's a financial condition? If we do have some kind of financial crisis, I think it's going to be pretty easy for the powers that be, the Obama faction, the Marxist faction of the establishment elites, the Organizing for America faction. I think it's going to be fairly easy for them to start to turn on more direct opposition to Trump. Again, if we do have a financial crisis, I'd say pending a financial crisis or pending some mass protest event, I really see Antifa struggling. So we could see tier 1 cities return to this kind of 2017 style direct action. My outlook, at least for now, of course, anything could change. Who knows what happens tomorrow? But if conditions stay the same right now, even with deportations, I don't see any kind of 2020 style or anything on the scale of 2020. Now, if Democrats fail to retake the House or the Senate, I think the risk rises substantially because they have to stop any kind of Trump policies. Trump, if he's lucky, he's got 2 years to get done whatever he wants to get done. And even then, he's going to have to fight with Republicans. He's going to have to fight with the courts and the lawfare and the court orders and all that stuff. But if Trump is given 4 years with a GOP majority in the House and Senate, I think the risk goes up substantially. One more point on this. Robert has covered this multiple times. UAW President Sean Fain has been previously pushing for all these unions to negotiate their contract expiration for May 1st, 2028. And that is May Day, International Workers' Day. And so I could see a case of some 2028 style national crisis led by the unions. And of course, this is something that the far left is obviously going to jump into. The socialist faction of the Democrat Party obviously going to pro-worker faction going to jump into that. So I guess my bottom line here is I think large-scale action is far more likely in 2028 than it is going to be for the next couple of years, probably through the end of next year, pending some kind of financial crisis. Bottom line here, I don't see Antifa Black Bloc having the kind of freedom of movement that they had back in 2020. Seattle and Portland police have made arrests. They don't seem to have any kind of desire to allow direct action demonstrations to go through. I still think the most dangerous course of action remains the far left is smaller, but more violent. The most dangerous course of action is 1970 style terrorism. I'm not sure. I don't think that's the most likely, but it's something I'm keeping an eye on. And I'll tell you, it's really tough to project into the future what these potential courses of action could be, because there's so low level activity right now. There's just not enough really strong indicators pointing towards one direction or another. And that's what I've got for this week. With that, we'll bring Max on. As always, push your questions into the chat. We will, as soon as we wrap up with Max here, we will get to the Q&A session. Max, good morning again. Let us know what's going on in Gaza. Apparently there is a ceasefire. You said last week it's unlikely to last. What's the bottom line here?
Right, Mike. So Hamas has reemerged in control of Gaza. Basically, uniformed, armed, and organized elements of Hamas operating as security forces emerged this week. Why now? Well, because the Israelis stopped bombing them. And Hamas military and governance elements are going to use this break to reestablish reassert control over the territory. And it's not just escorting aid trucks and operating as security or police forces, but it's also rooting out any political opposition and making that opposition disappear ahead of phase 2 and phase 3 negotiations for this ceasefire. So the impact, quite frankly, this overt return of Hamas, it's kind of, it could have been done a little bit better, but this overt kind of thumb in the eye of Israel was cheered by the Palestinians in Gaza, because the Palestinians are Hamas and Hamas are the Palestinians in Gaza. There's really no line between the two. It's not just a political movement. It is an expression of the Palestinians in Gaza. Well, this was all viewed as a bad sign by folks in Israel who were hoping the ceasefire agreement could progress to a long-term or permanent peace. Not looking so good. Outlook, I'd say Hamas has no intention of giving up control of Gaza. We've heard some talk about the phase 2, phase 3 discussions of who is going to govern Gaza and bringing in interim peacekeeping forces from, say, the UAE and Saudi Arabia or some other countries. But I find that highly doubtful in its current configuration, because nobody wants to roll into Gaza and have an active, armed, organized Hamas working behind the scenes to undermine their peacekeeping efforts. And that's exactly what would happen. I think we all know that. So I anticipate Hamas will continue rearming and solidifying its control over Gaza. That's going to be a red line for Israel. And the implications are it's unlikely that ceasefire agreement will continue past phase 2, because if Hamas is still in control of Gaza, then Israel has lost the war, plain and simple. Israel does not, will not tolerate, at least under the Netanyahu government, a rearmed and refitted Hamas in control of Gaza. So I kind of expect to see a resumption of combat operations following the initial exchange of hostages for prisoners at the end of this phase 1. We'll see like day 16 of this ceasefire in phase 1. We're supposed to start seeing negotiations on phase 2. I'd keep my eye on that just to see what starts shaking out, because I think we're going to have a resumption of combat, and I think the final outcome is going to be rather draconian.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is interesting, Max, because I'm seeing a convergence of trends here. So earlier this week, we reported that the Israeli Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, is going to resign in early March. Israeli media also published that the heads of the Shin Bet, Israeli Air Force, Israeli Navy, and then 2 other generals are also expected to resign. And Jared and I had this discussion about whether Israel's trying to change horses midstream, or do these departures from very senior officials reflect probably the end of major combat operations. This is something that Trump has pushed for. So what do you make of that?
I have a couple of thoughts on the Israeli resignations of the high-level security services people. I mean, some of these resignations I think are genuine, honorable moves to accept responsibility for allowing the October 7th attack. I think a few of them are just getting out of the way of a very ugly scenario that they know lies ahead. They maybe had a hand in allowing the October 7th attack, and that's already taken a big chunk out of them. And they're looking and seeing the conflict that lies ahead. And there's going to be some internal conflict in Israel too, with the resumption of combat operations in Gaza, because a lot of Israelis want the war to be over, not because they had this abiding love of Palestinians in Gaza, but they don't want their own people being killed in a continuous war that extends beyond the reasonable level of expectations, or beyond achieving certain reasonable objectives. So there's going to be some internal conflict, and maybe some of these resignations are just guys getting out of the way of the train wreck. So, but you did mention the whole Trump problem, and that is going to be a difficult issue, because Trump wants to see this thing go away. He understands supposedly Israel's red lines, and this Hamas thing is a red line. So I don't really see any way to get around not continuing combat operations as long as Hamas exists and controls Gaza. And I think it's going to be a disappointment for the Trump administration. They'll probably work very hard to try and to mitigate this, to find some third way to move Hamas out of the way, so Israel, can make this a permanent peace agreement, and that way the Trump foreign policy establishment can get on with bigger and better and really more threatening adversaries and problems that we're facing, geopolitically across the world.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, great summary, Max. Last question before we move on to Q&A. The Israelis came out in the past couple of weeks and said they believe that Trump would back an Israeli strike against Iran. Trump has this he's moved his Gaza envoy now to his Iranian envoy. It looks like maybe that's something he's trying to prevent. I would also note that the Israelis and Hezbollah have also, I think they plan to extend their peace agreement or their ceasefire. At the same time, we have this at least tentative peace agreement here between Hamas and Gaza and the Israelis. Just looking at all this and knowing that Netanyahu does not want to be done with how he's reshaping the Near East. Just looking at the next year, are you more inclined to say it's above 50% or lower than 50% that Israel and Iran, or maybe the United States and Israel, gets into a war with Iran?
I think it's about 50%, basically. And Netanyahu definitely wants to, take care of the Iran problem before he leaves. But Netanyahu's time is limited, because just like we saw the chief of staff and some senior IDF officials and security service officials resign by taking credit for their failures on the October 7th thing, Netanyahu has to face that tribunal, quote unquote tribunal himself. He's got to face the wrath of the Israeli public, and his time in office isn't going to be infinite. So I think he would like to see the Iran thing taken off the plate, basically, Iran removed as a significant threat, particularly a nuclear threat. But that may be left to his successor. But I do think that if Iran continues in the direction it's going in terms of the construction of a nuclear weapon, that the Trump administration would back and probably participate or assist in strikes on Iran, neutralizing strikes, basically bringing Iran's military and nuclear capability, its long-range missile capability, and rubbling it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like now it really is the I'm not advocating this, obviously, but Iran is greatly weakened, and it sure seems like this may be an opportune time here over the next year. All right, Max, thanks for all that. Thanks for your take. We're going to now get to some questions here. We'll start with some questions in the chat. And this is for anyone. What grade do you give Trump in his cabinet leadership and key leadership picks? Has he sidestepped nominees who will undermine his agenda? There was some question about Ratcliffe's confirmation at CIA. Actually, let's bring Max on for your take. Ratcliffe, he was, I believe, previously the Director of National Intelligence for Trump. He seemed to be well liked. I don't know if he's an America First guy, but what do you make of his accession now to Director at CIA?
Well, I think it's a good sign. I mean, Trump has faith in Ratcliffe, and Ratcliffe definitely knows the depth of the swamp, having been made to swim around in it during the first administration. Ratcliffe was one of the few people who stood up and called a spade, especially on that, whole Hunter Biden laptop lie thing. He's got some credibility. Really, the point, the point with Ratcliffe is he doesn't seem to be carrying the axe, in the same way that maybe Patel and some of the other appointees in the administration, like Hegseth, are carrying in their departments. He seems more of a quiet guy, get things done behind the scenes, delegate, use exceptionally talented people to push through Trump's objectives. And that's what he did at DNI to the best of his abilities. I mean, he was hamstrung by some holdovers in DNI that shouldn't have been there, but the Trump admin really didn't understand how things work in the IC at that point. And so they kind of let Ratcliffe kind of hang it out a little bit to deal with that on his own. I think it's too early to tell. I mean, CIA has a way of capturing its directors. Anyone who comes in from the outside, it's a thing that they have. They are very good at it. So I would say we should revisit this in about 6 months and see what reforms Ratcliffe is making at CIA, and that will kind of determine the future over the next 3.5 years as to how far we get to kind of defanging and de-weaponizing that particular agency.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, great question and great response, Max. Thanks for that. I'll open this up to anyone. Next question is, what does the Chinese oil stockpile look like, and how long will the stockpile sustain a Chinese military operation? Listen, Jared, literally anybody jump on here. I remember it was right after COVID, like China was ramping up its purchases. I have an acquaintance. He's an oil trader, and he said the Chinese are buying so much oil, we don't even know where they're putting it. Like, we know where all these above ground oil storage facilities are. They're full, they're max capacity, and yet China still keeps buying oil. So they're obviously putting it underground somewhere. And then you look at, Jared, I forget it with the exact numbers, but it's something like 50% of the world's wheat stockpiles, 30% of the world's corn stockpiles that China has accumulated. And on one hand, you say, well, China has 1 billion people. That's a lot of people to feed. Of course, they have the world's largest stockpiles. But the geostrategic context here is that China is obviously preparing for something. And so what do you make of this? What's your answer to the question?
It would help if I unmute myself. I think the main question of how long will the stockpile sustain a Chinese operation is hard to answer, but the most important part. And I think it's not as long as most people would expect. China has to potentially keep itself afloat internally, which it cannot currently do, for probably a year or more while it weathers sanctions. Especially during any kind of blockade and invasion scenario, if you're going to run that, they need to be able to fuel themselves, fuel 1 billion people while fueling a high op tempo military campaign and maintain trade at the same time. Honestly, it would not shock me to find out that even with all of their reserves, they're still pumping through a lot of it. And maybe wouldn't even last 6 months. It's really hard to tell because we don't have concrete numbers. We don't on how much they have and how much they burn through. But I think it's a lot shorter timeline than what most people would probably expect.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for your perspective there, Jared. Great question. Good response. Let's move on. Trump is having a lot of success rolling back DEI initiatives in government. I'm going to tee this question up for Robert and Mark. Just very briefly, how long is this going to take? Can the Trump administration actually do a clean sweep of DEI throughout the federal government? It seems like not only a heavy lift, but like a massive, massive challenge here. How long will this take to unwind? Are we talking months? Are we talking years? Will it outlast the Trump administration? We'll go to Mark first and then Robert briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen like a lot of cynicism on our side, or people that are critical of DEI about these policies. And I mean, there's truth to that. DEI is going to persist in some form. And then those who were practitioners of DEI, whether officially or unofficially, are still going, many of them are still going to be employed. What we've seen is that these agencies are rebranding some of the positions and trying to keep people shuffled through. But that said, this is a big signal. And I think that depriving DEI of official endorsement is a big step. I mean, I think this is big. In the past, it was not this way. And then there are many agencies that tend to have a lot of resistance to some of these measures. They're not very popular, but then they're allowed to have these DEI commissars in their ranks. And I think those agencies are going to be a lot more thorough in trying to push this out onto the periphery. And if we see that after Trump does this over the next several years, and DEI starts to wane outside of the official apparatus, I mean, it's really a matter of time until this kind of falls by the wayside as something that becomes just an ornament of a prior time. And so to me, and I'm kind of bullish on this. I think DEI is done. I think it's gone. I think the ideology will maybe stay, but I don't really believe in ideology much. I think that when it comes to power, money, interests, that's really what makes the big moves. That's what makes people's behavior change. And so I think this will be marginalized. And if it continues on this course, I think DEI, it could rebrand later, but it's done in what we've known.
Those are my thoughts as well. Robert, I give the same question to you. Just generally, it seems like the proliferation of DEI and these positions and the indoctrination, once the funding stops and once you have directors who no longer say this is a priority, or even our priority is to root out DEI and adopt some meritocratic system. That seems like those are the two major drivers here. Robert, how long is this going to take Trump to do this?
On the government side, I think they're already doing it. There was a memo that went around after his executive order, I think from OMB, that said like, hey, we're aware that you're rebranding some of these offices and moving these people around. If you do that, you're in trouble. So I think that's one part of that on the government side is it's already happening. I've also been seeing unconfirmed reports from people who say they work in some of these DEI positions saying they've already been fired. Their departments are being cleaned out. On the private side, when you're talking about industry, I think that industry is going to respond to one where they perceive the power to be. And under previous administrations, Biden and Obama, the power was behind these initiatives, getting these people in place. And two, it's the money side, because a lot of these DEI programs, especially in private industry, are basically sinecures, political sinecures for people aligned with that support structure. And as that goes away, there's no reason now for some of these businesses and major banks, asset managers, et cetera, to keep it going if the money is drying up, especially as they're getting more attention paid on the mechanism, how they're using this money to actually implement DEI and ESG policies.
Mm-hmm. All right. We're going to move on to Doge again briefly. Vivek has left Doge. He's running for governor, I guess, in Ohio. Do you think Elon is trying to take control of Doge is the question. Doge has been built up. It's like the big thing. It's kind of like one of the flagship policies, I would say, of the Trump administration. Bring a wrecking ball, as Bannon would say, deconstruct the administrative state. But then you have Elon coming out and saying, yeah, we're probably not going to be able to cut, what was it, $1 trillion or $2 trillion or something like that from the federal budget. He came out and said, yeah, we're probably not going to be able to do that. So Mark and Robert, same question. We'll start with Mark. Doge, boom or bust?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more of a bust than a boom.
Robert, what say you?
I agree. I don't think this is because Elon is necessarily trying to like push Vivek out. I think it was over the whole H-1B thing, and that undermined a lot of. I think people saw that as undermining a lot of Trump's immigration agenda, and he was. I think he pretty much confirmed indirectly that that's what caused him to leave and go to Ohio to try to run for governor.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I've never seen any politician. I think I guess he's not a politician quite yet, but I've never seen anyone on the right self-destruct so quickly. I mean, literally in over a couple of days, that was it. He's completely done. Major unforced error. All right. We do have a couple other questions here, and here they are. Ben says, yesterday I read on X, this is earlier this week on our morning briefing. By the way, this is our early morning roundtable. We do this every Friday starting at 10 a.m. We also have an early morning briefing where we're talking about more time-sensitive stuff, especially on the warning side, every day, Monday through Friday, starting at 8 a.m. If you would like to join us, check us out, see what we're doing. You can go to www.earlywarningnetwork.com/trial. Try us out free for 7 days. You can see for yourself how we consistently beat the news. We beat them like a drum. All right, the question is, there may be an impeachment effort already in the works for Trump. Will the kind of lawfare and procedural pitfalls of his first administration persist this time around? Or do you think Trump has reached critical mass? Anybody? But I think, Mark, Robert, Max. Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the Democrats are deflated. I think we talked about this morning, that they're kind of scrambling for how they're going to respond to Trump. Some Democrats are looking at the popular support he got on certain topics like immigration, the economy, and looking for a way forward. And I don't think a lot of these kind of this kind of political warfare will take the same shape as it did during the Trump administration. Because if it did, I think they would have already been talking about, we're going to file articles of impeachment, et cetera, and it just seems like they're defeated. Mm-hmm. At least for now.
It does seem like that. It does seem like that. Robert, you've sat on a lot of, at least one of these, maybe several of the progressive political strategy calls, strategizing against the Trump administration. What are we going to do as part of Trump Resistance 2.0? It seems like their major line of effort is the midterms. It does not. It just really does seem like they're going to try to use the courts and use lawfare to block Trump. I've not seen any. It's still early. I've not seen any major indicators of the next political warfare. It will obviously go on, but it really does seem like they're trying to bide their time, build domestic opposition, sweep Republicans out in the midterms, and then in the Trump administration, at least his major legislative priorities, and then build towards a blue wave again in 28. Max, you said you had something on this. Are we going to see the same type of all-out political warfare, just total political war against Trump?
Mike, I'm not sure if we're going to see the level of widespread political warfare like we saw during Trump in the first administration. But I definitely think that the power agencies right now, when I say power agencies, I'm talking like, DHS, CIA, FBI, NSA, DOJ, all of those agencies right now are still in the hands of Trump's enemies. And they are preparing for a long struggle. Their whole MO, all of those power agencies have an MO, and that is they look to outlast whoever is in the White House if that person in the White House is not, politically aligned with their beliefs. So they are preparing their defenses. They are digging trenches and bunkers. They are hiding all the, the family jewels. They are doing whatever they have to so they can make it on the surface look like they're complying with Trump's ideology or objectives or directives. But really they're going to be slow rolling it, sandbagging it, doing things behind the scenes, and hopefully, keeping it from the eye of Trump's political appointees. That's their strategy right now. And the longer we go without Trump appointees at the tops of those agencies and their deputies and assistants at the tops of those agencies, the more those defenses are going to get built. And that's why it's really important right now for the Senate to get these confirmations through and approved, because right now there is some ugly, I won't use the F word, but there is some ugly stuff going on in the power agencies, and they're preparing to fight Trump. And it will look like, in terms of the power agencies, a lot like what happened during his first administration. So, this is this is the time to get in there. If we don't get people in there to kind of take control and start steering the ship in the right direction, it's gonna be very, very difficult for Trump in the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure that concern. I mean, Max, you spent time in the military, at CIA. You know how government works, and it really does seem like the big risk is that the Biden administration has had 4 years, or up to that point, had 4 years to do a major overhaul and get apparatchiks into every little nook and cranny. So it really does seem like a clean sweep of a lot of these offices. It's what it's going to take. We'll move on here to our last question, which is about the designation of Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Max, we've heard from U.S. politicians like old Eye Patch McCain talking about going into sending special operations forces into Mexico. The Mexican banks have been freaking out because of their due diligence they've got to do to make sure that their bank accounts aren't linked to Mexican cartels. One former Mexican finance official said it was know your customer, KYC, times 10. And so, otherwise those banks are going to get sanctioned for doing business with, or laundering, or being a part of the Mexican cartel cash machine. All right. So, are we sending troops into Mexico? What do you think about all this?
Mike, I think this is the stick here, the carrot and the stick thing. I think this is Trump using the stick in advance of maybe some of his surrogates working behind the scenes with the Mexican government, and possibly even with intelligence personnel working with surrogates for the cartels to kind of tamp down this fentanyl problem or completely eliminate it, and kind of avoid a ugly confrontation. Yeah, it sounds really good with people like Eye Patch McCain and the other folks who are just like chomping at the bit to like send SOCOM into Mexico. But the reality is, politically, that is a step we would rather not take. I would say the cartels are here to make money. Right? They're not in some insurgent group operating in Mexico who's dedicated to overthrowing the American influence in Mexico, or to take back the southern United States in some kind of weird Reconquista thing. They're business people. Now, they've gotten out of hand and they need to be trimmed back. And the best way to trim it back is to do it, without drone strikes, without night raids into Mexico, because then that pulls in a lot of the political riffraff that's associated with war. You start to see, congressmen on the left advocating for the cartels. You start to see ugly language about, oh my gosh, a JSOC unit hit this compound in Mexico, and they killed 30 poor innocent brown people that were doing nothing but farming and singing campfire songs together, which would be total bullshit. But that's what happens when you start doing night raids, when you start doing drone strikes. The information operations come out and it becomes really sticky, and it's a difficult environment to put our operators in. I don't think Trump has achieved dominance yet over the machine yet. when I say the machine, I mean the power agencies, the intelligence agencies, and DOD. He has not achieved dominance over them yet enough to be able to deploy SOCOM forces effectively inside of Mexico. So I see this as a stick. I mean, I'm not saying that Trump wouldn't do it. I'm saying I think this is a stick, and he's saying, hey, come to the table, Mexican government and cartel types, and let's work something out so we don't have to get into an armed conflict. But the current status quo is completely unacceptable, and we will do whatever it takes to change the current status quo.
Mm-hmm. Max, good answer. Last question, because this is so incredibly important. Do you remember a couple of years ago on one of our daily sit rep or early morning shows, the former president of Mexico, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, otherwise known as AMLO, pretty much fired DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. There was an anti-drug unit that was working alongside, in partnership with whatever Mexican, I guess the federales, the federal police, which I believe no longer exists. I think it's been replaced by the National Guard, which is kind of beholden. It was beholden to AMLO, and now it's kind of, I think, probably beholden to the leftist Morena party there. But there was a huge concerted effort to kick or remove any kind of power or influence of U.S. law enforcement from Mexico. And AMLO cited sovereignty. And what it really was DA was getting a little bit too close to the ties between AMLO and the Mexican cartels. Sheinbaum, the current president, is the protege of AMLO. She's another Morena leftist. Morena has these, maybe not literal, but they have these drug deals with the cartels. And the situation is these Morena politicians say, move drugs, move cash, do whatever, just leave us alone. And that seems to be the status quo of much of Mexico. So this is a sovereignty issue here. I think the big risk is, and would you agree with this, that Mexico under Sheinbaum starts to move closer to China as a response to maybe U.S. cross-border operations, any kind of violation of Mexican sovereignty. And it doesn't even have to be boots on ground. It just has to be the United States, Trump putting Mexico under his thumb. What's your take on that?
You know, that's a really good point, Mike, because that is a potential unintended consequence of being too heavy-handed in this thing with the cartels. Now, you know, when I say we don't want to send SOCOM forces across the border into Mexico, yet, to do night raids and drone strikes and that kind of kinetic action, I'm not saying that we shouldn't use something more deft, or which should be more deft in nuance, like Title 50 covert action. And I think that's the next stick that Trump needs to wield in front of Sheinbaum and say, hey, listen, you know, we know you guys have deals with the cartels. We know you do. And your assessment on that was exactly right. That's the whole thing that AMLO did. He was just like, hey, short-term gain. I'm not going to mess with the cartels. You don't mess with us. And then I'm going to get rich and famous and put my proteges in Mexican power positions. And we're all going to live happily, you know, ever after. Because AMLO doesn't give a crap what happens across the border in the U.S. and Sheinbaum doesn't really either, as long as it doesn't impact her government. But what we have to do is we have to make sure Sheinbaum understands that the current status quo is unacceptable to the U.S. and we will start doing things that are going to affect your government. And when I say Title 50 covert action, I don't necessarily mean pointed directly at the cartels. You can widen that out a little bit and start hitting things that matter to Sheinbaum's government. And it has to be handled in a very nuanced way, because you don't want to move into that unintended consequence of pushing them into China. But I would definitely say that if they started to pushing into China, then you could move with a little bit more hard power to make that stop. Either way, I mean, Mexico is our neighbor, and we have to look at what we do and how it affects Mexico in a good faith way, just like they have to look at what happens inside their borders, how it affects us in a good faith way. And right now, Mexico is not reciprocating that. Okay. They are not playing the game, and we need to get them to play that game.
Max, great explanation. Last thought, and then we'll end the show. You remember that show Narcos? And I remember there was the DEA agent down there. I forget if it was Kiki Camarena or the other guy, but he was talking to a Colombian official and talking about how Colombia needs to do more to solve this drug problem. And the Colombian official turns right back around. He says, "You know what? If there wasn't such demand for illicit drugs in America, we would not have a cocaine cartel problem." And that really does get to the root of the matter, is that overwhelming demand in the United States is fueling these cartels. So I think that's kind of maybe I wouldn't necessarily call it a center of gravity. Maybe it is the center of gravity for this whole thing, but I think much more needs to be done. And I'm not sure what that is, but it seems like if you could diminish demand for drugs domestically, you take a lot of the fuel that's behind these cartels. All right. Well, Max, Robert, Mark, Jared, thanks again for another great roundtable. Everyone, we appreciate your support. Again, we do this every Friday at 10 a.m. All major platforms, come join us. We're glad you're here. We especially love the Q&A part because we get to share our perspective on things going on around the world. And that's going to do it for today's roundtable. Everyone have a great rest of your weekend. We'll be back in your inbox on Monday morning, back on the morning briefing, 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.